this is quite clearly the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. And I think it's a preview, definitely, of, I think, things to come. I don't think this will be the first attempt. I think that the elites, the oligarchs right now, are smelling that nervous sweat. They are circling Vladimir Putin. They're waiting for that next opportunity.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests offer unique insights and analysis that you're not going to find anywhere else. In this week's episode, Marcus Kolga joins us again to discuss Wagner Group's attempted coup in Russia over the weekend and the fallout, the implications and stakes involved, what it means for Putin, Russia's domestic politics, and why Europe and the West more broadly must prepare for the potential collapse of the Russian state. This is the Expert Series. Maybe we can set the scene a bit. What would you say are the implications of the Wagner Group's march towards Moscow for Putin's regime and its grip on power in Russia?
Well, clearly it's exposed divisions within Russia, divisions within the leadership itself, the elite, among the oligarchs. And I think that for Vladimir Putin, whose own power, his legitimacy has all been sort of based on the fact that he is Russia's strongman, that he is the one person in Russia who can protect the Russian people, that facade has been, I think, irreparably damaged at this point. The fact that newspapers in Russia today are talking openly about these divisions, they are questioning Vladimir Putin's own power to a certain degree. They are speaking in terms that simply wouldn't have been used or even allowed before this weekend. And so I think this is quite clearly the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. And I think it's a preview, definitely, of, I think, things to come. I don't think this will be the first attempt. I think that the elites, the oligarchs right now, are smelling that nervous sweat. They are circling Vladimir Putin. They're waiting for that next opportunity. And as soon as that opportunity arises, I think there will be others that will take it. So this is, I think Vladimir Putin's in for an extremely bumpy ride in the coming weeks. Maybe it'll take months, but certainly in the near future, he's in for a rough ride unless he himself voluntarily steps down from power.
The thing is, as you and I both know, probably Putin's replacement might be worse than Putin, or might be just as bad as Putin. So, what can we come to expect in the coming months or years post Putin? I'm seeing headlines this morning along the lines of: the West must now consider the possibility of a Russian political collapse. The UK must prepare for sudden collapse of Russia and downfall of Vladimir Putin. What does that look like, and how do we prepare for that? What needs to be done?
Look, I've been warning, I think, the Canadian government and Canadians about this sort of possibility, the same possibility what we saw over the weekend. I've been warning of that this will be coming already for a number of years, and certainly over the past 15, 16 months, we already saw that invasion on February 24th, 2022. I mean, it's senseless, it's unstrategic. I think there are some pundits who simply don't understand Russia, who claim that it was a reaction to somehow to NATO, to some mysterious Ukrainian threat that we never saw. And Evgeny Prigozhin made it quite clear that he said this over the weekend, that this invasion has nothing to do with either of those issues. It has nothing to do with NATO. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. What this has to do with is Vladimir Putin holding on to power. It's about Vladimir Putin. And so we've known that this is all, Vladimir Putin is only being interested in Vladimir Putin for the past 23 years. And I think that this war is catastrophic. It was strategically foolish. And it was really the final nail in his coffin. And it is leading Russia towards some sort of political change. Now, what that change will look like, again, I think we had a preview of what it could look like over the past 48 hours. We could very well see someone like Evgeny Prigozhin, who is an ex-convict, a hot dog vendor who became a billionaire oligarch thanks to corruption within the Kremlin. He and his troops have been charged with mass atrocities in Africa, and certainly in Ukraine. This guy is a far-right neo-fascist thug. He is a criminal. And it is entirely possible that someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin could come to power. I would suggest that had he not turned around his forces, he had an absolute, I think that had he wanted to march upon Moscow, it's entirely likely that he would have walked into Moscow and even into Red Square and the Kremlin unopposed. Let's not forget that. And so, yeah, I think the Western world, Canada itself, needs to be prepared for a Russia that is either fragmented, falling apart, or that is run by this sort of a bloodthirsty dictator who is, potentially much worse than Vladimir Putin. Now, having said that, and my prediction that there will be a very bloody future for Russia in that transition, because a transition will happen. It's just a question of time. There's only so long that the Russian people will be able to tolerate that sort of a situation. They've already tolerated 23 years of Vladimir Putin. He's not made good on most of the promises he's made to the Russian people of improving their living standards. One in three Russian hospitals doesn't have running water, for example. The fact that Russia is failing, Russia's armed forces are failing on the front with Ukraine. There's nothing left for Vladimir Putin to offer to his people. And it's entirely unlikely that if someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin were to take over, that things would improve. The Russian people have already stood up and in protest against the regime. You'll recall when Alexei Navalny returned to Moscow and was detained, there were massive protests on the streets. Those have been largely repressed by the regime. But I think that the past 48 hours have demonstrated that Vladimir Putin isn't all that strong, that there is a weakness. And so I think that in the coming weeks and months, I think you'll see the Russian people develop and pick up some courage to come out to the streets, and eventually they will demand a democratic and free and democracy and freedom and rule of law in the future, because this sort of criminal regime is unsustainable, and I do believe that the Russian people know that they deserve better.
I'm wondering how the Wagner Group's rebellion to challenge Putin's authority impacts the Ukraine war in any way.
Well, it's going to have a significant impact. I think that over the past 5-6 months, we've seen that the Wagner troops were probably the most effective Russian troops on the ground. They were stuck in that meat grinder in Bakhmut. Prigozhin leveled that city. There's no one left in that city. It's uninhabitable. But they were the only ones to make any sort of significant gains in this war. Now you've effectively removed them from the front lines. There are reports that the Russian government is trying to integrate, or will try to integrate after July 1st, Wagner into the Russian armed forces. I think this is entirely unlikely. The troops serving in Wagner, especially those former members of the Russian armed forces, are much better paid with Wagner. They are respected by the commanders within Wagner, and I don't think they have any interest, in joining the regular armed forces. The regular Russian armed forces have demonstrated a complete incompetence in their leadership. The morale is incredibly low, and so I don't see that happening. And so we'll have to see where these troops go. There's some suggestion that from Prigozhin himself that these 25,000 troops may follow him into Belarus. I think we have to keep a close eye on that, if that is indeed the case. And we also have to remember that anything that we're reading coming out of Russia, anything that Prigozhin says, anything that Putin says, anything that Shoigu or Gerasimov say, we can't trust any of that to be true. And so keeping an eye on Prigozhin's troops, what they're doing in Belarus. Is it possible that they may try to open up a new front on the Belarusian border with Ukraine? I wouldn't rule it out. But I wouldn't rule out Prigozhin disappearing once he arrives in Belarus. He cannot remain. I doubt he can remain alive just alone. He needs hundreds of his forces surrounding him to ensure that that Vladimir Putin doesn't come after them. Because ultimately, you can't challenge Vladimir Putin's own power without any sort of consequence. And so. Yeah, I think the impact again of all of this on the war effort is that Russia has lost its best fighters for the time being, and I think that the Ukrainian forces should be taking advantage of that.
I'm wondering if we can dive a little deeper into this subject. What factors do you think may have motivated Prigozhin to organize this march on Moscow? And what might it suggest about his influence or ambitions?
Well, look, Prigozhin has been complaining about the lack of provisions being sent to him, the lack of ammunition, weapons, and such over the past 6 months while he's been engaged in what's happening in Bakhmut. But I would say that Prigozhin's also made his own bed. Any time that he's had any sort of success on the battlefield, he immediately has claimed credit for it. And instead of raising the Russian flag over sections of Bakhmut when they were defeated, he raised the Wagner flag instead. And so this is Yevgeny Prigozhin is very much in this for himself. I'm not sure that he's certainly not in it for Vladimir Putin and not even necessarily for Russia. He's a criminal, con man, and an entrepreneur. And so I think that the Russian armed forces recognize this, and that's why the delivery of ammunition and weapons went down to a trickle, essentially, over the past couple of months. This enraged Prigozhin, and certainly it didn't help that on Friday, Russian armed forces, helicopters, and aircraft apparently started firing on the Wagner camp in southern Russia. And apparently 30 Wagner soldiers were killed during those strikes, and that's what immediately inspired Prigozhin to react and march on Rostov. I think personally, he is clearly ambitious. I think he sees himself as at least commanding Russia's armed forces, if not becoming one day president himself. I don't think we can rule any of that out. And I think that Vladimir Putin recognizes this, which is one reason I also believe that, again, unless Prigozhin is allowed to bring along several hundred, if not several thousand of his troops to Belarus, I don't think that Prigozhin has much time left in this world.
Last question for you, Marcus. In light of the ease with which Wagner seized a major Russian city and their subsequent progress towards Moscow, what would you say this incident reveals about the readiness and competence of Russia's military and security forces?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, it's a great question. And this is one I've been talking about in the media for the past 48 hours as well, is that, we're only seeing part of what was happening. We were seeing these tanks roll into Rostov, and indeed, there was very little resistance. The fact that Yevgeny Prigozhin was able to basically walk up to the Southern District Military Headquarters, which is basically the hive, the brain of much of the activity, much of the invasion that's against Ukraine, that he was able to walk in there unopposed and basically walk around inside the courtyard. The fact that his troops, his tanks were able to travel nearly 1,000 kilometers, pretty much unopposed, through Voronezh and up to 200 kilometers from Moscow, makes me believe that there was probably something happening behind closed doors. We don't know what was happening politically. What we do know is that on Saturday, many of the leading oligarchs, including Roman Abramovich, who was very close to Vladimir Putin, they fled, and they haven't gone back. They flew off to places like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey. We don't know what their position is on any of this. And quite frankly, we haven't heard from Shoigu or Gerasimov. We don't know what's happening in Russia's military leadership either. There were some images that were broadcast on Monday, apparently of Shoigu visiting with some troops, but those were apparently archival images. So we simply don't know what was happening behind the scenes, and so there's that aspect of it. The fact that there really was no opposition also, I think points to the fact that of the level of morale in the Russian army. They didn't seem to care about what was happening. They allowed Wagner to pass, and the fact that there was no opposition coming to the streets in Rostov to support Vladimir Putin, I think that's the biggest sign. Now, whether that means that those people living in Rostov, the Russians living there, that they're interested in seeing a change in regime, or whether they're just apathetic, who knows? But the fact that these Wagner troops were getting high fives from some of the people, the residents of Rostov, that they were able to just sort of walk into convenience stores, drink coffee, and casually walk around without any sort of opposition, leads me to believe that that this is just another signal that the Putin regime is extremely weak. It is unpopular. And again, I think Vladimir Putin probably recognizes this and is most certainly quite nervous about his own position right now.
Marcus, thanks for your thoughtful responses. Thanks for joining me once again. Before we wrap up, I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts about any of the events that have transpired in the last 48 hours or so, and maybe you could contextualize it within this question of, well, why should Canadians care?
Well, look, I think that Canadians need to be keeping a close eye on this. We need to care because what happens in Russia is going to affect much of what happens in Central and Eastern Europe and the Arctic as well. This affects everything around us, and so we should be paying very close attention to what's happening in Russia right now. If we had someone like Prigozhin take over, Canadians need to remember that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government laid claim to all of the natural resources underneath the Arctic Sea, right up to our 200-mile economic exclusive zone 2 years ago. They've also built 23 offensive capability bases in the Arctic. Now, Vladimir Putin hasn't been doing much with them, but someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin might. He is very much interested in natural resources. He's been active in Africa for the better part of the past decade. And the Arctic is, of course, rich with these sorts of resources. So, in that sense, we need to be aware of what's going on there. And I would also say that the Canadian government needs to prepare for that transition. I can't emphasize this enough. I think that the Canadian government, if we can play a role in the future of Russia. And we can do that by working with Russian civil society groups, Russian independent media, supporting them, and giving them all the tools that they need so that when that time comes, when there is that opportunity for a democratic transition, they have all the tools and resources they need to successfully make that transition. And this is something that we should be actively looking at immediately. Now is the time to do that. And I think this weekend demonstrates the urgency of that.
Thanks for joining me again, Marcus. It's always great having you on the program. And thanks again for meeting with me on such a short notice and making some time for us in your busy schedule.
Of course. Anytime, Josh.
Well, that's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.